I'm sorry. Is that some kind of prop? The voice, slick with condescension, cut through the stale air of the courtroom. It belonged to Judge Albright, a man whose tailored suit seemed to be holding in a surplus of self-importance. He leaned forward over his polished oak bench, his gaze fixed on the small, unassuming piece of metal hanging from a blue ribbon around the old man's neck. Martin Kelly said nothing. At 87 years old, he had learned the value of silence. His hands, gnarled with age and memory, rested on the wheels of his chair. He sat perfectly still, a small, quiet island in the sea of bureaucratic indifference that was courtroom 3B on a Tuesday morning. The judge was speaking to him, but Martin's eyes were focused on the American flag standing in the corner, its colors looking tired under the fluorescent lights. "Sir, I am addressing you," Judge Albright snapped, his patience already a distant memory. The bailiff, a portly man who had been half asleep moments before, shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt groaning in protest. "The rules of this courtroom are clear. No hats, no sunglasses, no decorative medallions. Remove it." Martin Kelly's public defender, a young nervous man named David, shot to his feet. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Kelly, is not wearing it as a decoration. It is a part of his identity. A military commendation of, I don't care if it's a key to the city, counsel." Albright cut him off, waving a dismissive hand. "This is a place of law, not a parade ground. It is a distraction and a transparent attempt to curry favor with the court. It will not work. Now take it off, or I will hold you in contempt." The charge against Martin was almost laughable. A citation for an overgrown hedge. A neighbor new to the area had filed a complaint with the city, and Martin, having missed the initial notice while at a VA appointment, now found himself here, in front of this petulant man playing king. The judge's demand hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. The other people in the courtroom, a collection of tired faces waiting for their own minor tragedies to be adjudicated, began to murmur. They looked from the judge's angry, florid face to the old man in the wheelchair. Martin's expression remained unchanged, a stoic mask of quiet dignity, but his silence seemed to infuriate the judge even more. "Did you hear me, old man?" Albright's voice rose, losing its polished edge and revealing the raw ego beneath. "Are you deaf as well as stubborn? Bailiff, assist the defendant in complying with the court's order." The bailiff lumbered forward, his face a mixture of reluctance and duty. He stopped beside Martin's wheelchair, his large frame casting a shadow over the old veteran. "Sir," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you heard him. Let's not make this difficult." Martin finally turned his head, his pale blue eyes meeting the bailiff's. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't need to. He knew the type. Men who mistook authority for honor, who confused a robe for a mantle of wisdom. He had seen them his whole life, in and out of uniform. "This medal," Martin said, his voice raspy but clear, each word carefully chosen. "This medal does not come off." Judge Albright's face turned a shade of crimson. "That is a direct refusal of a court order. That is contempt. I am warning you, Mr. Kelly. You are trying the patience of this court. What is that thing anyway? Some VFW prize for best parade float?" A few sycophantic chuckles echoed from the prosecutor's table. David, the public defender, looked horrified. "Your Honor, that is the medal of silence, counsel. I am done with this." Albright pointed a trembling finger at Martin. "One last chance. Remove that trinket, or I will have you escorted to a holding cell where you can sit and think about what it means to respect the law." The word trinket landed like a physical blow. For the briefest of moments, the drab courtroom dissolved. The smell of disinfectant and old paper was replaced by the scent of cordite and hot foreign dust. The judge's sneering face was gone, replaced by the grim, sweat-streaked face of a four-star general. Martin was 20 years old again, standing on a makeshift stage on a forward operating base. His body was a roadmap of fresh bandages. His ears still rang with the echoes of battle, but he stood tall. The general's hands were heavy and sure as he draped the blue ribbon over Martin's head, the star-shaped metal cool against his skin. "Son," the general had said, his voice thick with emotion, "your country can never repay you, but it will never forget." The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving an ache in its place that had nothing to do with old bones. It was the ache of a promise being broken. In the back of the courtroom, sitting on the hard wooden benches, was a young man in a slightly too large suit. His name was Ben Carter, a junior prosecutor waiting for his own case to be called. He'd been scrolling on his phone, bored, but the escalating confrontation had captured his attention. He didn't know the old man, but he knew military awards. His father had been a colonel. Ben squinted, his eyes widening in disbelief as he focused on the medal. It was unmistakable. The light blue ribbon, the field of stars. It couldn't be. There were so few of them. He watched as Judge Albright continued his tirade, his voice dripping with venom. He saw the old man's quiet defiance, the bailiff's hesitant posture, the public defender's helpless panic. A cold fury began to build in Ben's chest. This was not just a legal proceeding anymore, it was a desecration. Judge Albright, sensing he had the upper hand, leaned back in his chair. "Let the record show the defendant is refusing to comply. I am ordering a brief recess. When we return, Mr. Kelly, you will either be without that medal, or you will be in custody. Perhaps a night in a cell will improve your hearing." As the judge swept from the room into his chambers, Ben saw his chance. He stood up, his heart pounding, and slipped out of the courtroom doors into the hallway. He fumbled for his phone, his thumb shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. He didn't call his boss. He didn't call the court administrator. He called his father's old executive officer, a man who was now a colonel at the Pentagon. The phone rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Colonel Hayes." "Colonel, it's Ben Carter, General Carter's son." "Ben, good to hear from you. How are things in the civilian world?" "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but something is happening, and I don't know who else to call." Ben's words came out in a rush, a torrent of controlled panic. He explained where he was, what he was seeing. He described Judge Albright, the wheelchair, the overgrown hedge, and the medal. "He called it a trinket, sir. He's threatening to jail him." Ben took a breath. "The veteran's name is Martin Kelly." There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Ben thought the call had dropped. When Colonel Hayes finally spoke, his voice was transformed. The friendly warmth was gone, replaced by a tone of chilled steel. "Say that name again, Carter." "Martin Kelly, sir." Another pause, this one filled with a palpable sense of shock and urgency. Ben could hear the muffled sound of a chair scraping back, of papers being shoved aside. "Where are you exactly?" "Give me the address, the courtroom number." Ben relayed the information. "Stay there, son," the colonel commanded. "Do not let that judge put his hands on him. I'm making a call. Help is on the way." The line went dead. Ben stood in the empty hallway, his own breathing loud in his ears. He had just thrown a rock into a very, very large pond, and he was about to see the ripples. Inside the sprawling headquarters of the nearby army base, Colonel Hayes didn't just walk. He strode with the kind of purpose that parted crowds. He didn't knock on the door to the commanding general's office. He opened it without breaking stride, his face grim. General Thompson, a man whose calm demeanor was the stuff of legend, was in a meeting with his senior staff. He looked up, his eyebrows raised at the unscheduled intrusion. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption," Hayes said, his voice tight. "But I just received a call from a trusted source, a civilian courthouse downtown." He laid out the situation in clipped, precise sentences. The name Martin Kelly was the last thing he said. The name dropped into the room like a grenade. The quiet hum of the meeting ceased. Pencils stopped moving. General Thompson's friendly expression evaporated, replaced by one of stunned disbelief that quickly hardened into a cold, dangerous fury. He looked around the table at his staff, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the service. He saw his own shock mirrored in their eyes. "Martin Kelly?" Thompson asked, his voice a low growl. "Sergeant Major Martin Kelly? Are you certain?" "Positive, sir," Hayes confirmed. General Thompson stood up, the sheer force of his movement making the heavy chair slide back. "That man is a living legend. He is the standard by which we measure ourselves." He turned to his aide. "Get the car. And get me the official dress uniform. We are leaving. Now." To Colonel Hayes, he said, "Get a security detail. 2 vehicles. Class A uniforms for everyone. I want to be there in 15 minutes." The office exploded into a whirlwind of controlled, urgent activity. Phone calls were made. Orders were barked. The name Martin Kelly was passed down the line, each repetition adding to its weight, its power. To the soldiers on that base, it was like hearing that a monument had been defaced. It was an insult that could not and would not be tolerated. Back in courtroom 3B, the recess was over. Judge Albright returned to the bench, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He expected to see a defeated old man, stripped of his prop and ready to beg for leniency on his hedge citation. Instead, he saw Martin Kelly, exactly as he had left him. The blue-ribboned medal still hung around his neck, a silent act of defiance. The judge's face tightened into a mask of theatrical fury. "I see you have chosen the path of foolishness, Mr. Kelly," he sneered. "I find this behavior utterly contemptible. You come into my courtroom, a place of order and respect, and you mock its traditions with your stubborn pride." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper that carried through the silent room. "Bailiff, take Mr. Kelly into custody. He will be held for 48 hours for contempt of court, and while he is there, I am ordering a full psychiatric evaluation. Clearly, A man of his age who behaves with such irrationality is a potential danger to himself and others. This was it, the final overreach. The threat of a holding cell was one thing. The threat of a forced psychological evaluation was a cruel, targeted blow, an attempt to strip Martin of not just his mettle, but his very sanity and dignity. David, the young public defender, was about to object, to scream, to do anything, when the great wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. They didn't bang open. They opened with a smooth, deliberate weight that commanded attention. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway were three men. They were not police officers. They were soldiers, dressed in the impeccable dark green fabric of the Army's Class A service uniform. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine, their chests adorned with neat rows of ribbons, their bearing radiating an aura of absolute unwavering authority. In the center was a man who seemed to carry the very gravity of the room on his shoulders. The 4 silver stars on each epaulet glittered under the harsh lights. He was tall, imposing, and his face was a mask of cold, controlled rage. It was General Thompson. The bailiff, who had been moving toward Martin's wheelchair, froze mid-step. His hand, which had been reaching for Martin's arm, dropped to his side as if scalded. The entire courtroom fell into a deep, profound silence. The only sound was the rhythmic, powerful click of the 3 men's dress shoes on the linoleum floor as they advanced down the central aisle. They did not look at the judge. They did not acknowledge the bailiff or the lawyers or the stunned onlookers. Their path was direct, their focus singular. They were walking toward the old man in the wheelchair. General Thompson stopped directly in front of Martin Kelly. For a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. The 4-star general and the forgotten sergeant major. A silent conversation passed between them, a shared understanding forged in a world far removed from this shabby courtroom. Then, in a movement that was sharp, precise, and full of a reverence that bordered on worship, General Thompson brought his right hand up to his brow in a slow, perfect salute. The 2 officers flanking him mirrored the action instantly. 3 men representing the full might and honor of the United States Army, saluting a disabled veteran in a wheelchair over an overgrown hedge citation. The crisp sound of the salute echoed in the tomb-like silence. The general held it, his eyes locked on Martin's, his arm as steady as a marble statue. Judge Albright, from his perch on high, finally found his voice. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his face a comical mask of confusion and outrage. "This is a court of law. You have no authority here." General Thompson did not break his salute. He did not even look at the judge. He spoke to Martin, but his voice was a deep, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the room, a voice accustomed to commanding thousands. "Sergeant Major Martin Kelly," he said, his voice ringing with power and respect. "It is an honor to be in your presence, sir." He slowly lowered his hand. He then turned, not fully to face the judge, but enough to make it clear who he was now addressing. He looked out over the stunned faces in the gallery. "For those of you who do not know," the general began, his voice a lesson in controlled fury, "and for the benefit of the court, let me tell you who this man is. This is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. 65 years ago, in the frozen hills of Korea, then Sergeant Kelly's platoon was ambushed and overrun. He was wounded in the first volley. His platoon leader was killed. The general's gaze swept the room, ensuring everyone was listening. For 3 days in sub-zero temperatures, bleeding from 3 separate gunshot wounds, Sergeant Kelly held his position alone. He repelled 4 enemy assaults, he protected the lives of 4 wounded men who could not be moved, and he facilitated the eventual rescue of his entire company by calling in artillery strikes on his own position. He refused to be evacuated until every one of his wounded men was safe. The general took a step toward the judge's bench, his eyes finally locking with Albright's. "The trinket you ordered him to remove is the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest award for valor in combat. It is bestowed for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of one's life above and beyond the call of duty. It is not a prop. It is not a decoration. It is a symbol of a debt that can never be repaid." A wave of gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were pulling out their phones, not to text but to record. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. A sense of collective shame and awe settled over the room. They had been watching a man be humiliated, and they had just discovered he was a giant. "Federal law, Your Honor," the general continued, his voice now dangerously soft. "Specifically Title 18, Section 704 of the U.S. Code, protects the unauthorized wearing of this medal, but it also enshrines its sanctity. To order its removal in a public forum is an act of such profound disrespect. It is an insult not just to this man but to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform of this country." Judge Albright was pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The robe that had seemed so imposing moments before now looked like a cheap costume. The gavel in his hand seemed like a child's toy. General Thompson turned back to Martin, and for the first time Martin Kelly spoke to someone other than the bailiff. His voice was quiet, but in the pin-drop silence it carried the weight of decades. "Respect," Martin said, looking up at the general but speaking to the whole room. "Respect isn't something you can demand with a robe or a gavel. It's not about titles. It's about what you do when no one is looking. It's about how you treat people, especially the ones you think have no power." He then turned his head and his clear, unwavering eyes found Judge Albright. "You wanted me to respect your courtroom, sir, but you showed no respect for the man who came into it. There's a difference." His simple, powerful words hung in the air, a more damning indictment than anything the general could have said. As Martin spoke of respect and sacrifice, a final fleeting image filled his mind. It wasn't the ceremony or the glory. It was the moment just before the third assault. He was lying behind a frozen log, his rifle jamming from the cold, his leg a searing agony. Next to him, a young private, a kid from Ohio named Miller, was shivering, not from the cold but from fear. Martin reached over, his own gloved hand clumsy with frostbite, and clamped it on the boy's shoulder. "Stay with me, son," he had whispered. "Just stay with me." It was that moment, that simple human connection in the face of annihilation, that was the true origin of the medal. It wasn't for the fighting, it was for the staying. The fallout was immediate and absolute. General Thompson personally escorted Sergeant Major Martin Kelly from the courthouse. A crowd had already gathered outside, drawn by the fleet of black government vehicles and the sight of uniformed soldiers. News cameras were arriving. The story was out. Within a week, Judge Albright was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full investigation by the state's Judicial Conduct Commission. His career was, for all intents and purposes, over. His name became a byword for judicial arrogance. The State Bar Association, in a move of proactive damage control, swiftly implemented a new mandatory training program for all court personnel on veteran affairs and cultural sensitivity, a program they unofficially named the Kelly Rule. The city quietly dropped the citation for the overgrown hedge and sent a crew from the Parks Department to personally landscape Martin's entire yard. About a month later, a man in a rumpled suit approached Martin as he was sitting on a park bench, enjoying the afternoon sun. It was Albright. He looked smaller without his robe, his face etched with a kind of weary shame. He stood for a moment, shifting his weight, before finally speaking. "Mr. Kelly," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to apologize, in person. What I did, there is no excuse. I was arrogant, and I was cruel, and I was wrong. I am so deeply sorry." Martin looked up at the man who had tried to humiliate him. He saw no triumph, only a quiet sadness for a man who had lost his way. He gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. Hesitantly, Albright sat down. "We all make mistakes," Martin said, his gaze fixed on the children playing on the nearby lawn. "The trick is to learn from them. The uniform, the robe, the wheelchair, they're just things. It's the person inside that matters. Don't ever forget that." They sat in silence for a few more moments. Two men from different worlds, bound together by a single unforgettable afternoon in a forgotten courtroom. Stories like Sergeant Major Kelly's remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most unassuming forms. If you were moved by his story of courage and dignity, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more.